I'm gonna tell you a story about my hometown. It's a place called Dak Nong in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. Most people, when they think of Vietnam, they think of the big cities, Saigon, Hanoi, but Dak Nong is different. It's all red dirt, coffee plantations, and these winding rivers that cut through the jungle. It's beautiful, honestly, but like any beautiful place, it has its secrets. Now, Vietnam is a country with 54 ethnic groups. The majority are the Kinh, that's the ethnic Vietnamese you usually hear about. But in the highlands, you have all these other communities, the ED, the Monong, the Thai, and others. They've lived side by side for generations. It's a mix, and in my village, that mix was mostly the other groups. There were maybe 10 Kinh families. The rest were from different ethnic backgrounds. Everyone got along fine. But sometimes, when something bad happens, those old lines blur. That's where this story starts. This happened back in 2009 or 2010. I was just a kid then, but my parents told me about it, and the whole village talked about it for years. It was one of those stories that felt like it came straight out of a folktale, except it was real. There were 2 incidents within a single month, and they ended up being connected in a way nobody expected. The first incident involved a woman. Let's call her Toy. She wasn't from the highlands. She was from Hanoi, the capital up north. She was Kinh. A local guy, also Kinh, had gone up to Hanoi for something, met her, and convinced her to come back to the village with him. At first, it was like a fairy tale. Imagine this city girl moving to this remote, red dust place to be with a guy who had some land, some coffee trees. Everyone thought it was romantic. She was this gentle, quiet woman from the city, and he was the local guy who'd lucked out. For the first year or 2, things were good. She got pregnant. They were going to have a baby. But then, while she was pregnant, her husband got scammed, lost everything. Seriously, the guy went from being one of the wealthier families in the village, he had land, crops, a future, to almost bankrupt overnight. And he couldn't handle it. He started drinking. He'd come home and scream at her. He never hit her while she was pregnant. I think even he knew that was a line, but the verbal abuse was constant. There were nights she'd be 7, 8 months along, and he'd kick her out. She'd have to waddle to a neighbor's house, this huge belly, just to sleep somewhere safe. People tried reasoning with him, telling him to get his crap together for the sake of the baby, but he was lost in his own bitterness. She had the baby, a little boy, and that's when things got really dark. After the birth, Tui started to change. It was like something in her broke. You hear about postpartum depression, but in a village like that, nobody takes you to a doctor. They just watch you fall apart. And her husband didn't help. He was still drinking, still angry, and now he started hitting her. For years, that was their life. He'd beat her. She'd take the kid and run for a few days. He'd drag her back, beat her again. The kid grew up watching that, and somewhere along the way, Tui stopped being the gentle city girl. She started breaking. People say she developed a mental illness, but it was the quiet kind, the kind that creeps up on you. She'd laugh at strange times. She'd wander off. And worst of all, she started hurting the kid. Not like her husband, not with fists. She'd scream at him, drag him around. Sometimes she'd even pick up a knife and hold it to his throat. The neighbors would see and freak out, screaming that she was going to kill her own kid, calling her completely freaking insane. And Tui would just stand there, this weird smile on her face, like she didn't understand what she was doing. Nobody ever asked why she became that way. They just saw a crazy woman hurting her kid, and they turned against her. Now, her husband, he had a relative, a distant aunt or something, a wealthier woman who owned a few plots of land. She didn't like Toy. She saw her as a crazy outsider who was ruining her nephew's life, so she made him an offer. Get rid of her, divorce her, take the kid and keep him safe. If you do that, I'll give you a piece of land, a few hectares, enough to start over. And the husband, who had been eyeing that land for years, he took the bait. He started treating Toy even worse. He'd accuse her of being a bad mother, of being insane. He filed for divorce. He berated her, telling her she was unfit to be a mother and demanding she just go back to Hanoi. Toy's own mother came down from the north to try and take her home. She arrived one afternoon, and she was furious. I mean, this was a Hanoi woman, tough as nails. She marched right into that house and tore into her son-in-law, furious that he had dragged her daughter out to this godforsaken place, only to treat her like garbage. She made it damn clear she was taking Toi home. They argued all afternoon. Finally, Thui's mother said she was leaving. She was going to catch a bus to the nearest town, then fly back to Hanoi. She told Thui to come with her. The two of them started walking down the dirt road, heading out of the village. It was early evening. They'd walked maybe a kilometer when Thui's phone rang. It was her husband. She answered. She listened for a minute. Then she hung up. Thui quietly asked her mother to wait at a tea stall up ahead, insisting she had to go back because he wanted to talk. Her mother grabbed her arm, pleading with her to ignore him since he was already throwing her away, but Thui stubbornly promised to return in half an hour. Her mother hesitated, but Thui had that look, the stubborn, broken look she'd developed over the years. So the mother let her go. She sat at the roadside stall. She waited. Half an hour passed, then an hour, then two. Thui didn't come back. Finally, she walked back to the house. The husband was sitting inside, eating dinner, watching TV. The kid was already at his grandmother's place. Her mother demanded to know where Toi was, but the husband just shrugged it off, casually claiming she had called to say she was coming back but never actually showed up. Her mother didn't wait. She ran out into the night, flashlight in hand, calling her daughter's name down every dirt path, knocking on doors, asking anyone still awake if they'd seen her. She searched until she couldn't stand anymore. But the village was dark, and the jungle around it was vast. There was nothing to find that night. At first light, she went straight to the local authorities. They organized a search. By mid-afternoon, a local man, one of the ethnic villagers who went into the forest to gather firewood, found her. She was floating in the river, just under a small bridge. She had drowned. The police came. They investigated. The husband had an alibi. He'd been at home all evening, and several neighbors confirmed it. There were no visible injuries on Toi's body. The official conclusion was suicide. She had a history of mental illness, they said. She must have thrown herself into the river. Her mother was devastated. She had to wrap her daughter's body in a tarp and put it on a bus back to Hanoi. There was no funeral in the village. The husband wouldn't allow it. All right, this is where the story starts to get, I don't even know the word. Strange doesn't quite cover it. Let me try. There was a young guy in the village, maybe 17 at the time. Let's call him Fat. He was a local kid from one of the ethnic groups, and he used to work for Thui's husband back when the husband had money. He was like a right-hand man, a loyal kid who ran errands and did odd jobs. But after the husband lost everything, Fat moved on. He went to work on a rubber plantation, and they barely saw each other. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? Woman drowns, case closed. But a week after Thui died, something happened to Fat. He completely lost it. And when I say crazy, I mean completely lost it. Like, lights on nobody home lost it. He'd wander to that same bridge where Thui's body was found, and he'd just kneel there, staring at the water, for hours. Then he'd go into the village and approach random women, especially women who looked like Thui, in their late 20s, with long hair, and he'd just start crying, dropping to his knees and begging them for forgiveness over and over again. He'd get down on his knees, right in the middle of the road, and apologize to strangers. It got so bad that his family had to have him committed to a mental hospital. They strapped him into a car and drove him away. Obviously, the village started talking. You can't keep something like that quiet in a place that small. Why was Fat losing his mind over Thui's death? He hadn't been around for years. What did he have to be sorry for? Then someone remembered. The night Thui died, right after her mother let her go back to the house, there was a rumor that her husband had borrowed a large sum of money, 50 million dong, which back then was something like 2,000 bucks. For a guy who just lost everything, that was a small fortune. He told people he needed it urgently, for some deal. A few days after Thui's death, he paid it back, in full. No one knew where the money had gone in between. The pieces started fitting together in a way that made everyone's skin crawl. But there was no proof, just whispers. And then, A few weeks later, the second incident happened. There were these 5 teenagers, all of them from the same area, but from different ethnic backgrounds. India, Minong, a mix. They were young. The oldest was maybe 17. They liked to hang out, drink, cause trouble. One evening, they were riding around on their motorbikes and they came across that bridge, the one where 2 had drowned. There was still police tape up and some incense sticks that people had left, the ends still smoldering. The air smelled like burnt jasmine and wet mud from the river, but the kids didn't care. They saw a nice spot under the bridge, a flat patch of ground by the water, and they decided to set up a drinking session. They started around 5 in the evening. The light was already starting to fade, the kind of dusk that makes the river look oily and slow. A few locals passed by on foot and warned them not to drink there because a woman had died in that exact spot, but the kids just laughed it off, telling the old-timers to mind their own damn business. One of them cracked open a bottle of rice wine, the cheap stuff, the kind that smells like rubbing alcohol and burns going down. They passed it around, the glass bottle slick with condensation. Under the bridge, the sound of the water was muffled, like it was coming from inside a wall. Every few minutes, a car would cross above, and the whole concrete slab would hum for a second, then go quiet again. As the evening went on, they noticed something strange. A woman kept walking back and forth on the bridge above them. She'd appear at one end, walk across, disappear, then a few minutes later, she'd appear again. The same slow, even pace. She was wearing simple clothes, a plain blouse, dark pants, and her hair was long, hanging straight down. From below, they could never quite see her face, just the silhouette. The kids, being teenagers, started catcalling, whistling. One of them shouted something crude. The woman didn't respond. She didn't speed up, didn't look down. She just kept walking. Her footsteps on the planks above were too quiet, almost like she was walking on something soft. The second time she crossed, one of them jokingly muttered that she was probably just deaf. The third time, nobody made a joke anymore. They just watched her. There was something about the way she moved, too smooth, too mechanical, like a pendulum. After maybe the 5th or 6th time she crossed, the oldest kid got an idea. Feeling bold from the cheap booze, he told his friends to watch as he went up to talk to her. He climbed up to the bridge, approached her, and they disappeared into a grove of bushes nearby. 15 minutes later, he came back down, grinning, urging the others to take their turn since she was just lying in there waiting. One by one, the 5 kids went up to that grove. Each time, the same thing. They found her lying on the ground, completely passive. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't resist. They did what they wanted, took turns with her, drunk and careless. And when they came back down, she'd already be walking the bridge again, back and forth, as if nothing had happened. They thought it was the luckiest night of their lives. They drank more. They took turns. The woman kept crossing, kept going into the bushes, kept lying there. Nobody spoke. She never said a word. They went home that night feeling like they'd struck gold. A week later, they went back. Same spot, same time, same woman. But this time, something was different. They started drinking again, waiting for her to appear. And she did. Same walk, same silence. The oldest went up first, but this time, he didn't come back after 15 minutes. They waited half an hour. Nothing. The second kid went up to check on him. He didn't come back either. One by one, the rest of them climbed up to the bridge. By the time the last 2 went up, it was dark. They found the first 3 sitting in the grove, cross-legged, eyes closed, swaying back and forth like they were in a trance. They looked like they were being controlled. The 4th kid asked what the hell was wrong with them and where the woman went. The 3 of them opened their eyes at the same time, and then they attacked. They went wild, grabbed rocks, sticks, whatever they could find. They were screaming, swinging, trying to kill each other. The last 2 tried to run, but the first 3 were on them in seconds. In the chaos, someone pulled out a small knife, the kind they used to cut weeds in the fields. and they started stabbing. By the time neighbors heard the noise and ran over, 3 of the boys were dead. 2 were barely alive, covered in wounds. The survivors later told the police that while they were fighting, they heard a voice whispering in their ears. A woman's voice, with a northern accent, just like Tui's. Kill him, and I'll be with you. Kill him, and you can have me." It said the voice kept them fighting until they couldn't move anymore. The police interrogated them. They were just kids, the 2 survivors. They told the whole story, about the woman on the bridge, about the grove, about the voice. The police didn't believe them at first. They thought the kids were on drugs or making up excuses. But then they showed them a photo. It was Tu's wedding picture, the only photo they could find. The 2 boys went pale. Not the pale of fear you get when you see a spider. This was the color of milk, the color of someone whose blood has just turned to ice water. One of them practically stopped breathing, his voice cracking as he whispered that she was the exact woman they saw. The police officer looked at them like they were completely insane, flatly explaining that the woman in the photo had drowned herself in that exact river a month ago. And then it hit them. It hit them like a truck backing up to run them over a second time. The younger one started shaking his head frantically, muttering over and over that it was impossible because they had touched her, realizing with absolute fucking horror what they had actually done. The other one just sat there, frozen, his bandaged hands trembling in his lap. I can picture it, the way he must have been replaying that night in his head, frame by frame, suddenly noticing all the things his drunk brain had smoothed over. The way she never blinked. The way her skin felt normal at first, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was no pulse, no breath, just the cool stillness of something that shouldn't be warm at all, and the smell. He never mentioned it at the time, but later, in the hospital, he told a nurse. She smelled like river water, not the clean kind, the kind that sits stagnant under a bridge, thick with mud and old incense. She never spoke, not one word. She never looked them in the eye. She never changed position, never moved unless she was walking that bridge. When they pulled her into the bushes, she just lay there, limp, silent, like a doll. And when they finished, when they stumbled back to their beer and their stupid laughter, she'd be gone, walking again, back and forth, like she was stuck in a loop. The younger one barely managed to whisper that they didn't even know her name. The other one just stared hollowly at the officer, the realization finally settling in that they had been with a dead body. The room was quiet for a long time. The officer put the photo down. He didn't know what to say. What do you say to 2 kids who just realized they'd been intimate with a ghost? One of them started crying, not loud, just tears running down his face while he stared at the floor. The other one kept shaking his head, slower now, like he was trying to convince himself it was all a dream. But it wasn't a dream. The 3 bodies in the morgue proved that. The stab wounds, the rocks, the blood in the bushes, and that voice they both heard, whispering in their ears while they fought. Kill him, and I'll be with you." A northern accent, just like Duchess. They never went back to that bridge. I don't think they ever drank again either. I know that was a long detour, but trust me, it all ties together. Because what happened to those kids wasn't the end. The story wasn't done with Fat yet. Looking back, I think whatever was left of Tui, her anger, her pain, wasn't done yet. She'd already pulled 3 boys into that bloody fight under the bridge. But the 2 men who actually killed her, she was saving them for something worse. For 2 years, everything was quiet. Fat was in the mental hospital, catatonic. They said he just sat there, staring at the wall, sometimes muttering things no one could understand. The husband had gotten his land from the wealthy aunt, and he'd worked it well. He was growing durian, coffee, getting rich again. He built a new house, bought a new motorbike. He was living the life he thought he deserved. And then, one night, something happened at the hospital. No one knows what. The night nurse said there was no sound, no commotion. But the next morning, they found Fat sitting up in bed, fully awake, looking around like he'd just arrived from somewhere far away. He looked around in confusion, asking the orderly where he was and why he had been locked up. The doctors tested him. He was lucid, completely normal. No sign of the catatonic shell he'd been for 2 years. They let him go. When he got home, he started talking, and he told everyone the truth. The husband had called him that night, ordering him to wait by the bridge. His plan was to lure Tui back and have Fat push her in, just to scare her into fleeing back to Hanoi. He had convinced Fat she was a good swimmer and promised him 50 million dong to wipe his debts clean. Fat didn't know that Tui couldn't swim. He pushed her, and she sank, and he watched her drown. When the police ruled it a suicide, Fat thought he was safe, but the guilt, or whatever followed her, ate at him until his mind just broke. 2 years of catatonia. And then, when he came back, he confessed. I wasn't there when he confessed, but my parents told me he said it all in this flat, empty voice, like he was reading a grocery list. No tears, no begging for forgiveness, just the facts. That, to me, was almost worse than the killing itself. That was the moment the dominoes started falling again. But this time, they weren't falling on innocent kids. They were falling on the ones who deserved it. And that was it. The end of the domino chain. You know, I look back on that story and I think about how fragile everything is. The husband lost his money, then his mind, then his humanity. Tui went from a sweet city girl to a broken woman who held a knife to her own child's throat. Fat was just a dumb kid who needed money, and he ended up a killer. And those 5 teenagers, they were just bored, stupid kids who wanted to drink by a river. One bad thing led to another, and another, until the whole village was tangled in it. My parents used to tell me that story whenever I complained about something small. They used to warn me to be careful, reminding me that you never know which domino you're about to knock over. I think about that a lot, and I think about Tui. They say her spirit walked that bridge until the truth came out, and once it did, she finally let go. But I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if she's still there, watching, waiting for the next domino to fall. I don't go near that bridge when I visit home. You know that feeling when you're so tired, your brain starts to glitch, like the world goes a little soft around the edges and you can't tell what's real. That's what happened to me. But back then, I didn't know it yet. My name's Tan, not my real name. I still work in the aviation industry, and it's a small world. People talk. So let's just say I'm a guy in his 40s now, but this story is from over 20 years ago, back in 2004 or 2005. I was 21, maybe 22, fresh out of university. And thanks to my father's connections, he'd been in the industry since the old days. I landed a job at one of the big airports in Saigon. I wasn't a pilot or a flight attendant. I was the guy standing at the check-in counter, checking passports, printing boarding passes, making sure everything ran smoothly. Back then, everything was manual. No self-check-in, no online booking. If a flight left at 6 in the morning, people started showing up at 3. You had to be there, in uniform, ready to handle the paper tickets, the stamps, the whole ritual. The airline I worked for was foreign. I won't say which one. They've since pulled out of Vietnam, but back then they had a small presence. Just one gate at this airport, Gate 12. If you know that airport, you know Gate 12 was at the very end of the terminal, almost tucked away in a corner. You had to walk maybe 200 meters past the other gates to reach it. It was quiet there. Most days the airline only had 1 or 2 flights, sometimes 3, during holidays. So my job was simple. Show up a couple hours before the flight, do my thing, go home. For the first month, it was all daytime or early evening shifts. Nothing unusual. Then they changed the schedule. Suddenly, our flights were happening in the dead of night, the first around 11:30 p.m., the second at 5:30 a.m. That meant I'd arrive at 9 for the first one, finish around 1 in the morning, and then either go home and come back at 3, or stay. Going back and forth didn't make sense. My family lived in Tan Binh district, close to the airport, but driving home at 1 a.m. just to turn around 2 hours later felt pointless, so I decided to sleep at the airport. Now, I was new. I didn't want to sprawl out on the passenger benches and look unprofessional, so I looked for a hidden spot. There was a big staircase near Gate 12, the kind that leads up to the upper levels. And underneath that staircase, there was this space, like a crawl space, but bigger, big enough for a guy to lie down. It was dusty, but I figured it'd be okay for a couple hours. That first night, after the 11:30 flight finished, I walked over to the staircase, and I remember thinking, it's really clean. The floor tiles were spotless, and there was this faint smell of floor cleaner, like someone had just mopped. I thought, lucky me. I put my bag down as a pillow, lay on my back, and closed my eyes. I was exhausted, completely screwed up, from being awake for almost 20 hours, and I started to drift off almost immediately. And then I heard voices. Not close. It sounded like a crowd in the distance, the kind of noise you hear when a flight lands and people spill out into the terminal. Laughter, talking, men and women, even a kid crying, and footsteps, a lot of footsteps. The echo of shoes on polished floors, the rumble of suitcase wheels. I was still in that half-awake state where your brain tries to explain things. I thought, it's probably the national airline. They have gates nearby. They're always busy. I kept my eyes closed, letting the noise wash over me. But the noise didn't fade. It got closer. 10 seconds. 20. The voices became clearer, the footsteps louder. I could hear the distinct click-clack of high heels, the heavy thud of men's shoes, the rattle of suitcases being pulled along. It felt like a large group was moving toward Gate 12. I started to feel uneasy. I thought, wait, my airline doesn't have passengers this early. The next flight isn't until 3. I sat up, groggy, and started tucking in my shirt, trying to look presentable in case someone saw me. I was still listening to the sounds. They were right there, maybe 10 meters away, around the corner. I stood up, walked out from under the staircase, and looked down the corridor. Empty. The hallway stretched all the way to Gate 1. Not a single person. No sound. Nothing. I checked my watch. It was 1:15 a.m. I'd only been asleep for 15 minutes. I told myself it was just sleep deprivation, that my brain was just playing some damn tricks on me because I'd been awake too long. I lay back down, closed my eyes, and tried to relax. Again, I started to slip into that peaceful, almost dream state. And again, the sounds returned. This time, it was the unmistakable noise of luggage being dragged downstairs, that heavy, rhythmic rattling of hard plastic wheels violently bouncing against every single concrete step in a continuous loop that made my stomach tie into knots. And the worst part was, it didn't sound like just one suitcase. It sounded like a dozen, coming down the staircase above me. Mixed with the scrape of shoes, the chatter of voices, a whole crowd descending. I sat up again, my heart beating a little faster. I told myself, maybe security is directing people this way. Maybe it's a detour. I stood up, fixed my uniform, and walked toward the gate. I unrolled the velvet rope, getting ready to check passengers in. I stood there, waiting, listening to the sound of footsteps and luggage coming down the stairs. I looked up toward the staircase. Nothing. The noise continued. Clatter, shuffle, voices, but no one appeared. It was like a recording playing on a loop. I waited. 30 seconds, a minute. The sounds kept going, but the staircase remained empty. Finally, I walked to the bottom of the stairs and took one step up. Silence. Instant. Like someone had turned off a radio. I felt my skin crawl. I looked at my watch again. 1:30 a.m. I'd only been lying there for 15 minutes. This is wrong, I thought. I knew this airport had a long history. It went back to the war. There were stories. I'd heard things. But until that moment, I'd never believed any of it. I didn't go back under the staircase. I didn't sleep there again. I just walked out of the terminal, into the parking lot, and stayed awake until the passengers started arriving. That was the first night. The second night, I decided to be smart. I'd sleep on one of the passenger benches at my own gate. I'd set my alarm for 2:45 a.m., get up before anyone arrived, and no one would know. The benches were well lit. I'd be safe, so I did that. After the 11:30 flight, I lay down on the bench near gate 12, set my alarm, and fell asleep. This time, I didn't hear anything strange. I slept soundly. Too soundly, apparently. I woke up to someone shaking my shoulder, a female flight attendant from a different airline, demanding to know who I worked for, and telling me I needed to get up because her passengers were arriving. She was looking at me with a confused expression. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, still half asleep, and groggily asked her what gate we were currently at. She frowned and flatly informed me that this was Gate 1, her airline's assigned area, and demanded to know why the hell I was sleeping there. I looked around. The numbers on the walls didn't make sense. I was at Gate 1, the very first gate in the terminal. My gate was Gate 12, at the opposite end, nearly 200 meters away. I checked my watch. It was 3:30 a.m. I'd been asleep for over 2 hours. I looked down the corridor. I could see passengers gathering at Gate 12 in the distance, waiting for me. I stood up, and immediately I felt it. A deep, bone, suns-deep exhaustion, like I'd been dragged across the floor. My whole body ached. Someone had moved me from Gate 12 to Gate 1 while I was asleep, and I hadn't woken up, which absolutely scared the crap out of me. I didn't understand it. I still don't. I ran back to my gate, apologized to the waiting passengers, and got to work, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. By the third night, I was terrified. I went to a pagoda, bought a protective amulet, put garlic in my pocket, anything. I was determined not to sleep at the airport again, but that night, after the first flight, I drove home. I tried to sleep in my own bed, but I couldn't. I lay there, eyes wide open, watching the clock. 1 a.m., 2 a.m. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't shut down. Finally, at 2:15, I gave up. I got on my motorbike and drove back to the airport. I arrived at 2:45, 10 minutes before the next flight's check-in. I stood at my gate, too afraid to sit, too afraid to close my eyes. I had my laptop open, ready to start. I was so tired I could feel myself swaying, my eyelids drooping, and then I heard footsteps again. These were different, heavy, deliberate. The sound of boots, military boots, echoing down the hallway. I forced my eyes open and looked up. About 30 meters away, 4 men were walking toward me. They were in uniform, military uniforms, but not the green fatigues you see today. These were older, darker, with peaked caps and insignias I recognized from old photographs. The man in front had a holstered pistol on his hip. The ones behind him carried rifles. I froze. My first thought was, who were these guys? Where did they get those uniforms? My second thought was, this is a problem. You can't walk into an airport carrying guns. I reached for my radio. I pressed the button. Static. I tried another channel. More static. I could hear the security people on the other end, but they couldn't hear me. The radio was dead. The 4 men kept walking. They passed my gate. They didn't even look at me. They just kept going, toward the staircase at the end of the corridor, the same staircase where I'd tried to sleep. I watched them walk into the darkness under the stairs. They didn't climb up. They just disappeared into the shadows. And as soon as they were gone, my radio crackled back to life. A confused voice finally crackled through the speaker, asking what was going on. I shouted into it, frantically demanding security at Gate 12, because 4 men in old uniforms carrying guns had just walked right under the staircase. Within seconds, 4 or 5 security guards came running, batons and flashlights in hand. I pointed to the staircase, breathlessly telling them that the men had just gone in there. The guards approached slowly, flashlights sweeping the darkness. One of them shined a powerful beam under the stairs, lighting up every corner. Empty. No one was there. No men. No uniforms. No guns. The lead guard turned to me, visibly annoyed. and asked if I was just wasting their time. I desperately swore that I had seen them with my own 2 eyes, and I practically dragged him under the stairs to point out the fresh footprints in the dust. The floor was filthy. Dust, dirt, cobwebs, and there, in the dust, were footprints, fresh ones, leading into the shadows. The guards looked at them, then at each other. One of them shrugged. I asked for a flashlight. I shined it into the deepest part of the crawl space, a narrow alcove at the back. That's when I saw them. 3 incense urns, old, covered in dust and spiderwebs. The incense sticks in them had faded from red to pale orange, the paper wrappers crumbling. Some cigarette butts had been stuck into the sand, their filters rotted and swollen with moisture. I stared at them, my heart pounding. The security guard behind me saw them too. One of the older guards put his hand on my shoulder and pulled me back, quietly urging me to just get back to my gate because the passengers were arriving. I pleadingly asked him what those things were. He lowered his voice, explaining that the airport had a long, bloody history from the war that nobody was allowed to talk about. He glanced at the urns. "Do your time, get transferred, and don't make any fucking trouble," he whispered. Then he walked away, signaling the other guards to follow. I stood there for a moment, looking at those 3 urns. They weren't an altar. There was no space for offerings, no pictures, no names. Just 3 urns, tucked into the darkest corner of a forgotten stairwell, untouched for decades. It looked like a seal, a containment. I clasped my hands together and bowed. I desperately whispered an apology into the dark, telling whatever was trapped in there that I was just a clueless kid who didn't know any better, and I begged them to leave me alone, chanting a desperate Buddhist prayer for the dead, hoping the rhythm of the ancient syllables would somehow build a wall between their world and mine. Then I went back to my gate and checked in the passengers. After that night, nothing else happened. Every time I worked the night shift, I'd stand at the base of that staircase, bow respectfully, and say a quiet prayer. I never slept under it again. I never even sat down near it. 2 months later, I was transferred to a different position, ground security, then baggage handling, then management. I've been in the industry ever since, but I've never forgotten Gate 12. The airline I worked for pulled out of Vietnam years ago. The gate itself is almost never used now, only during peak holidays when the terminal gets overcrowded. Most of the time, it sits empty. I've gone back a few times over the years, just out of curiosity. Last time was maybe 2 years ago. I stood at the staircase, shined a flashlight into the crawl space. The urns are still there. 3 old incense urns, covered in dust, hidden in the darkness. After all these years, almost 50 since the war ended, they've never been moved, never been cleaned, never been acknowledged. I don't know who put them there. I don't know who they're for. I just know that every time I walk past that gate, I bow my head and keep walking. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some things are only meant to be respected. And if you ever find yourself at that airport, late at night, walking toward Gate 12, don't go under the stairs. Just don't. This story goes back to 2013. I was completely exhausted back then, working some dead-end shifts, dealing with the miserable heat every single day. You know that feeling when you just need to escape your own life for a minute? Yeah, that was me. I'd just gotten my license, scraped together enough for a beat-up manual bike, and me and a few buddies decided we had to go to Dalat, a highland city where the fog is so thick at night it feels like the mountains are trying to swallow you whole. The problem? None of us had money. Like seriously broke. Between the 5 or 7 of us, we barely had a few million dong. That's maybe a couple $100 total. Not exactly 5-star hotel money. It was a crap situation, honestly. But when you're young and dumb, you don't really care. Then one guy in the group, his name was Ann, mentioned that his older brother worked on a farm up there. The brother had been calling him non-stop, insisting that we just needed to buy the food and he'd handle the booze, offering us a spot to crash in one of the greenhouses. He warned us it would be freezing, but hey, it was free. So we figured, why not? We'd spend the day in the center, then head out to the farm at night. We left Ninthuan, a coastal oven where the wind literally burns your skin, around 6 or 7 in the morning. For those who don't know, it is just a couple hours from the highlands. You go through those winding passes like Nguyen Muke, a terrifyingly steep pass where one wrong turn sends you off a cliff, and Tapao, a stretch of road so desolate you rarely see another soul. Beautiful roads, but at night they feel like they go on forever. We spent the whole day eating, wandering around the market. By 6 in the evening we were drunkish, bought some meat to grill, and started driving toward the farm. Anne's brother had specifically instructed us to arrive before dark, telling us we'd have to park at a neighbor's place because the dirt path to the greenhouses was way too narrow for bikes. When we turned off the main road and into the alley, the road got smaller. Then we had to park and walk maybe 200 meters through fields of scallions, lettuce, chilies. The smell of fresh vegetables was everywhere. And that's when we saw the house. It wasn't a French colonial ruin. It was a villa built in the 90s, maybe late 80s. Small, 2 stories, with that old-school French-inspired style. But it sat right in the middle of all those greenhouses, completely isolated. I remember jokingly asking Anne if his brother secretly owned the place. The brother just laughed it off, explaining that he was just a farmhand. He told us the landowner had built it back in the day, some super rich couple who lived abroad but came back for vacations. But then something happened. He mentioned the wife had died overseas, the husband never came back, and the house had been completely abandoned since before he even started working there. We walked past the villa, all of us staring. It looked old, dusty windows, vines creeping up the walls. But Anne, the youngest in our group, maybe 15 or 16 at the time, kept acting confused, arguing with us that the house looked brand new. He swore the paint was fresh and the windows were perfectly clean. His brother smacked him on the head, calling him blind. He got a little irritated, explaining that the inside was a total wreck, full of dust, cobwebs, and rat shit, and that he only used it to store potatoes now. Anne just rubbed his head, still muttering stubbornly that he was seeing a beautiful, really nice house. We all laughed it off, figured the kid was just messing with us. We got to the greenhouse, set up the grill, started drinking. The brother had brought out bottles of rice wine. It was one of those nights where you lose track of how many times you send someone to buy ice, or cigarettes, or peanuts. And then since he was the youngest and wasn't drinking much, became the errand boy. He'd run back and forth to the main road, maybe a 700-meter round trip past that villa each time. 4 times, maybe 5. Every time he came back, he'd say something about the house, but by the 9th or 10th beer, none of us really paid attention. We were just brushing it off, thinking it was just a bunch of crap. I remember it was past 9 when he came back with another bag of ice. He sat down, looking way too excited. He started rambling about how the lady in that house was incredibly nice, claiming she'd been talking to him every time he passed by. He said she asked where we were from, and even offered to let us sleep in her place, promising to make us warm milk and cook for us. The brother looked at him like he was losing his freaking mind. He aggressively reminded Anne that nobody lived there, reiterating that he'd been storing stuff in that filthy abandoned building for 3 years, and there wasn't a single piece of furniture inside. But Anne just shook his head in denial. He kept insisting she was there, describing her in this really nice knitted outfit with kind eyes and graying hair. He told us that when he mentioned we were staying in the greenhouse, she had warned him we would freeze. Everyone laughed again. Drunk laughs, the kind where you don't really process what's being said. I just thought the kid was pulling a weird prank to scare us. Around 10 or 11, we all passed out on some thin mats inside the greenhouse. Sometime after midnight, I woke up needing to piss. I stumbled outside, found a spot near the edge of the vegetable beds, and was midstream when I heard footsteps. Soft, shuffling. I turned my head and saw Anne walking toward me, eyes half closed, moving slow. I mumbled something about whether he needed to piss too, and told him to come over. He didn't answer. He just kept walking past me, maybe 5 or 7 meters away, stopping right at the path that led back toward the villa. He stood there, facing that direction, and started talking, but he wasn't talking to me. He was nodding, politely addressing someone as ma'am, telling this invisible person that he had tried to tell us, but we didn't believe him. He repeated our complaints about the house being dirty and old, but then he reassured the thin air that he knew it was clean because he'd seen it. Then he actually asked if she wanted him to wake us up, promising he would try again. At first I thought he was sleepwalking. People do that, right? I was drunk enough to find it funny. I pulled out my phone. Back then I had a Nokia E71. It could record video. I stood there filming him. He was standing still, eyes still closed, head tilted like he was listening to someone. Then he turned around and walked back toward the greenhouse. He lay down and went completely still. I stopped recording. The file was maybe 40 or 50 seconds long. 3 seconds later, he sat straight up, eyes wide open now. He looked dead at me and excitedly announced that the lady had just talked to him again, insisting we should go sleep in her house because it was warmer. I just laughed, telling him I had just filmed him talking to himself. I pressed play. The video was gone. The file was still there, the thumbnail still there, but when I played it, it lasted maybe half a second. Just a flicker. Then it stopped. I muttered that it was weird, swearing up and down that I had hit record, but Anne wasn't listening. He kept pointing toward the villa, desperately trying to convince me that she was standing right there at the path, waving at us, asking how I couldn't see her. I looked. Nothing but dark shapes of greenhouses and the outline of the villa in the distance. No one. It scared the crap out of me for a second, but I pushed it down. I just told him he was tripping and ordered him to go to sleep. I lay back down. Didn't think much of it. Alcohol does that to you. My brain just desperately wanted to rationalize it, as a drunk teenager doing weird sleepwalking stuff. The next morning we woke up around 7. Everyone was groggy, nursing hangovers. We started getting ready to go back into Dalat for breakfast when one of the guys suddenly noticed Anne was missing. We looked around. His mat was empty. Someone brushed it off, guessing he probably went for an early walk like he always did. We called his phone. It rang, that old Nokia ringtone, the one everyone recognizes, but no answer. We called again, and again. Nothing. We started walking around the property, checking the greenhouses, the vegetable beds. Still nothing. After about an hour of searching, we heard the ringtone again, faint, coming from somewhere near the villa. The brother immediately shook his head, refusing to believe Anne would ever go in there, but the sound was coming from inside. We went to the front door. The house was dark, dusty, smelled of old wood and dried manure. We walked through the ground floor, following the ringing. It was coming from upstairs, but there was no staircase. I looked up. There was a second floor. You could see the ceiling, but the wooden staircase that used to be there had been removed years ago. The brother told us later that the landowner had taken it down around 2010 to reuse the wood in the greenhouses. We all looked at each other, someone whispering in absolute panic, asking how the hell he got up there. We brought a bamboo ladder from the farm. The brother climbed up first. When he reached the top, he leaned over the edge and yelled down to us that Anne was up there. Anne was lying on the bare wooden floorboards of the upper level, in a corner that was thick with dust, rat droppings, dead insects. He was curled up like a baby, eyes closed, breathing slow. The phone was buzzing next to his head. It took 3 of us to get him down. He didn't wake up until we carried him out of the front door. Then his eyes opened, glassy, confused. He sluggishly looked around and asked where he was. My heart was pounding out of my chest, and I completely lost my mind, screaming at him, asking how the fuck he even got up there when there was literally no staircase. He looked at the house, then at us, and this is where my blood ran completely cold. He calmly explained that the lady had taken him. He said that after we fell asleep, she came back, and he relayed her exact words with this terrifyingly innocent voice. She said, "Your friends are too drunk. Just come with me." He went on to describe how he followed her inside into a beautiful house. He talked about a spiral staircase that didn't exist, an old black and white TV from the 80s in the living room. He claimed he watched some old show for hours before she took him upstairs, telling him he could sleep in a warm, soft bed. We aggressively shut him down, frantically explaining that there was no staircase, no TV, and no bed. We told him he'd been lying on a filthy floor covered in rat shit, pointing out that his body was completely covered in dust and cobwebs. He looked at his clothes, touched his face, and went pale, desperately muttering that he had really seen it. We took him to a temple near the Vichai Pagoda, a towering structure covered in broken glass that glints like shattered teeth in the sun, then to the market. Fed him, tried to keep him awake until midday when the sun was highest. Slowly, he started to come back to himself, but for days afterward, he'd obsessively ask us if we really hadn't seen her, insisting she was so real. Later, the brother told us the truth about the house. The couple who built it, the wife had died there, in the early 90s, during one of their visits from abroad, a sudden illness. The husband took her body back overseas and never returned. The land, the house, everything was left to rot. But the wife's spirit, they say, stayed. Maybe she didn't know she'd passed. Maybe she was just lonely. All those years, waiting for someone to visit, to accept her hospitality. Anne had been the first person in decades who could see her clearly. The brother also told us that farm workers had occasionally woken up in that upper floor with no memory of how they got there. It happened more than once. After our trip, the family that rented the land finally got permission from the couple's son, who was in his 50s by then, to tear the villa down. They held a ceremony, invited a monk, did their best to guide her spirit to a pagoda in Dalat. Then they demolished the house and built more greenhouses over the land. If you drive through that area today, near Tram 8, a foggy little valley where the cold always seems to bite right through your jacket, you'll see rows of greenhouses covering the hills. You won't see the villa. It's gone. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet place, I think about what Anne described, a woman in a knitted outfit, waving from the doorway, wanting nothing more than to make someone warm milk and let them sleep in a soft bed. You know, it's funny how certain objects can become anchors, like a physical weight that drags you right back to a moment in time you've spent years trying to scrub from your brain. For me, it's not a creepy doll or an antique mirror. It's an old piece of technology, specifically an iPhone 5. If I close my eyes right now, I can still feel the exact weight of it in my palm. I can feel the smooth, cold metal of the back casing, and, more than anything, I can still feel that creeping, ice-cold dread crawling up the base of my neck whenever I think about where that phone ended up. To really understand how messed up this whole situation was, you have to understand where I was at in life. This was back in 2014. I was going by the name Trung, a high school senior living in a pretty quiet, dusty town in Vietnam. I was a good kid. I kept my head down, got straight A's, and did exactly what my parents told me to do. And in a traditional Asian household, being the good kid comes with a lot of expectations, but not a lot of freedom. We had a pretty big extended family, but the one guy who always stood out was my old man's brother, Hai. He was the boss of a construction crew, built entirely out of grit, smelling perpetually of cement dust, cheap strong coffee, and stale tobacco. He had money, a lot of it, but he was also completely chaotic in his personal life. The guy had like 2 or 3 different wives scattered across different provinces, and maybe 7 or 8 kids. But here's the thing, all his kids were daughters. So, for whatever reason, he latched onto me. He treated me like the son he never had. My parents provided the basics, food, shelter, tuition, but the contractor was the one who funded my entire childhood of luxury. Every time I passed a grade, he'd roll into town and buy me something ridiculous, a brand new bicycle, then an electric bike. He didn't just give gifts, he threw money at problems so he wouldn't have to deal with the emotional labor. So, fast forward to the summer before my senior year, I get my report card, and I completely crushed it. Top of the class, honors, the whole 9 yards. The old contractor comes to visit, sits me down in the living room under the slow, rhythmic clicking of the ceiling fan and asks me what I want. Now, back then, smartphones were just becoming the ultimate status symbol for teenagers. I wanted one so bad my teeth ached, but my parents were strictly old school. Their rule was absolute. No phones until you're 18, out of high school, and have a national ID card. I hesitated, but I told my benefactor the truth. I told him I needed a phone for school projects, to call friends. You know, the usual teenage lies. He just let out this raspy laugh, grabbed his keys, and told me to get on the back of his motorbike. We drove straight to the electronics store, and he bought me an iPhone 5 right on the spot. He dropped around 14 million dong, roughly $600, which was an absolute fortune for a high school kid in a rural town back then. When we got back, he gave me this dead serious look and warned me that he wasn't telling my parents, but if they caught me messing around on this thing instead of studying, he'd take it back and I'd better keep it safe. I was ecstatic. I treated that phone like it was made of glass, but the joy didn't last long. A few months into the school year, the old man got sick. It started as a bad cough, then tuberculosis, and then his body just entirely gave out. A guy who used to carry bags of cement on his shoulders withered away into nothing in the span of 4 months. His death hit the family hard, but the aftermath was even uglier. None of his wives wanted to take responsibility for his burial or his altar. They all just vanished, leaving the burden on my dad. We ended up burying him in a local graveyard about a mile from our house. I need to paint a picture of this place for you. It wasn't a beautifully manicured memorial park with neat rows of headstones. It was a chaotic, overgrown patch of land where people just buried their dead wherever there was space. The grass was always waist-high, the air always smelled faintly of damp earth and rotting jasmine, and the mosquitoes were the size of small birds. We set up his grave near the back edge of the property, right against a thick line of wild trees. A few months passed. The sting of his death dulled a bit, and I settled back into the boring routine of senior year. One suffocatingly hot afternoon, my buddy Hugh came over. We had this stupid hobby of going out into the fields and hunting wild birds with slingshots. We'd been doing it all week, and the birds had gotten smart. They completely abandoned the usual spots. Hugh, who was always the guy pushing boundaries, looked at me and asked if I was scared of ghosts. I asked him what the hell he was talking about, and he told me he'd been at the graveyard the day before with his mom to clean his grandfather's tomb. He said the trees in the back of the cemetery were absolutely swarming with birds. They'd all retreated there because nobody ever went in to hunt them. He told me that if I wasn't a coward, we could go in there because it was an absolute gold mine. I was 17. I wasn't going to let him call me a coward. So, around 5 p.m., we took my electric bike and headed to the graveyard. We parked outside the rusted iron gates and walked in. The air immediately felt heavier. You know that specific kind of stillness before a thunderstorm, where all the ambient noise just gets sucked out of the environment? It was exactly like that. We trudged through the overgrown weeds, the dry stalks scraping against our jeans, until we reached the back section. Hugh was right. There were birds everywhere, but the weird thing was, we couldn't hit a single one. We spent a solid 30 minutes firing pebbles into the canopy, and every single shot just barely missed. It was freaking frustrating. I was getting sweaty, annoyed, and the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting these long, jagged shadows across the graves. I realized we were standing pretty close to the old contractor's tomb. I figured, what the heck, right? Might as well ask for a little family favor. I walked over to his grave. I didn't have any incense or offerings, so I just pressed my palms together, closed my eyes, and whispered, "The old man, give your nephew a little luck here, will you? Just a couple of birds." While I was standing there, I pulled my phone out of my pocket to check the time. It was getting close to 6 p.m. I needed both hands to grab a good rock from the dirt, so I absent-mindedly set the iPhone down on a piece of rusty corrugated tin lying next to the grave. I picked up my slingshot. I aimed at a tree branch and heard that sharp, satisfying thud of a direct hit followed by the heavy fluttering of wings. I aimed again. Another thud. Another bird down. It was like a switch had been flipped. Suddenly, we couldn't miss. Within 10 minutes, we had knocked down nearly a dozen birds. The adrenaline was pumping, and we were completely caught up in the thrill of it. But then, the light shifted. The sun completely disappeared, and the graveyard was suddenly plunged into this deep, suffocating twilight. If you grew up in Vietnam, you know the superstition. You don't linger in a cemetery after 6 p.m. That's when the air changes. That's when the space stops belonging to the living. A cold breeze swept through the weeds, and both Hugh and I just looked at each other, the exact same thought passing between us. We need to get the hell out of here right now. We scrambled to pick up our catch, practically sprinting back to the front gate. We jumped on the bike and sped all the way back to my house, our hearts hammering against our ribs. We started gathering firewood in my backyard to roast the birds, laughing off the nervous energy. I reached into my pocket to pull out my phone so I could take a picture and brag to our friends on Facebook. My pocket was empty. Holy shit, my stomach just instantly violently dropped. The blood drained from my face. I patted down my other pockets, my jacket, everything. Nothing. I choked out to Hugh that I didn't have my phone. He froze. We both knew exactly where it was. It was sitting on a piece of rusty tin in the pitch-black back corner of a cemetery. It was almost 7 p.m. by this point. My parents would kill me. A $600 phone. A final gift from my dead relative, just sitting out in the dirt. I begged Hugh to go back with me, and even though he was terrified, he finally agreed because he saw the absolute panic in my eyes. We rode back. The cemetery at night was an entirely different beast. It was pitch black, silent except for the deafening hum of cicadas. We turned on our cheap little flashlights, the thin beams cutting through the humid darkness, illuminating cracked headstones and overgrown vines that looked like tangled limbs. We carefully navigated back to the grave. I shined the light exactly where I remembered standing. Nothing. The piece of tin was empty. We searched the surrounding grass on our hands and knees for 20 minutes. Hugh kept nervously checking over his shoulder, whispering that it was gone and some junkie probably swiped it, insisting that we had to get the hell out because the vibe was just wrong. I was devastated. I felt physically sick. We rode back home in total silence. I didn't even care about the birds anymore. Hugh went home, and I snuck into my house, avoiding eye contact with my parents. At the time, my older cousin, Min, was living with us. Min was in his 20s, a bit of a drifter. His parents had divorced, and his mom sent him to live with us to keep him away from the gambling dens in his hometown. He had a job at a local factory, but he still hung out with a sketchy crowd. I sneaked into Min's room and begged to borrow his phone. I locked myself in my bedroom, the air thick and stifling, and dialed my own number. I don't know if you've ever called a lost phone in a quiet room, but the sound of the ringing tone echoing in the earpiece is just agonizing. It rang once, twice, and then the line clicked open. My heart leaped into my throat as I whispered frantically into the receiver, pleading with whoever was there, explaining that I'd left my phone at the graveyard and it was a gift from a dead man, promising to pay them anything if they'd just give it back. There was no answer, just wind. The heavy, static sound of wind blowing across a microphone, mixed with the faint, rhythmic rustling of dry leaves, scraping against stone. I pleaded again, asking if anyone was there. Click. The call dropped. I tried again. Same thing. It would ring, connect, and just give me 15 seconds of dead air and rustling leaves before disconnecting. I called maybe 10 times. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold Min's phone. Finally, out of sheer desperation, I opened the messaging app. I poured my heart out into a text. I explained the whole situation, offered my entire life savings from my piggy bank, about $50, and begged them to return it. I sent my address and told them to contact this number. I deleted the call logs and the sent text from Min's phone, handed it back to him, and went to bed feeling like an absolute failure. That night, I didn't sleep. Not really. I kept drifting into these feverish, broken dreams. Every single dream was exactly the same. I was walking down the street with the contractor, right after he bought me the phone. The sun was glaring, and he was smoking his usual cheap cigarette, but he wasn't looking forward. He was staring directly at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. He told me in this weirdly hollow voice that echoed from the bottom of a well to keep it safe, reminding me that he couldn't buy another one because he didn't make money anymore. I would jolt awake, sweating through my sheets, my heart racing, and then I'd fall back asleep, only to have the exact same dream play out again. It happened 5 or 6 times before the sun finally came up. The next morning, I dragged myself out to the kitchen for breakfast. My parents were there, eating noodles, completely oblivious. My cousin Min was sitting at the table, looking incredibly annoyed. He slid his phone across the table to me. He snapped at me, asking what the hell I was doing with his phone last night, and who I was texting because some lunatic kept messaging him all night. I felt a cold lump form in my throat. I picked up his phone. I opened the messages. There was a string of replies from my own lost phone number, but it wasn't a demand for money. It wasn't a thief. It was the exact same sentence, sent over 20 times, back to back, between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Phone work, godson. But it was horribly misspelled, phonetically typed out by someone who barely had a middle school education. My blood ran completely cold. The hairs on my arms stood up. That was exactly, word for word, what the old man used to text me every time he bought me a gift. A week after he bought the electric bike, he'd text, "Bike work, godson?" A week after the iPhone, "Phone work, godson?" I stared at the screen, my vision blurring. This wasn't a junkie who found it in the dirt. I grabbed Min by the arm and pulled him into the hallway, confessing everything through tears and showing him the texts while begging him to drive me to the cemetery right now. Min rolled his eyes, calling me an idiot and saying it was probably just a prank by whoever stole it, but he finally agreed when I wouldn't let it go. We rode to the cemetery in the harsh morning light. It looked less intimidating now, just a sad, overgrown plot of land. We walked back to the grave. Minnie started poking around the grass with his shoe, insisting that it was gone. He stopped. He was staring at the concrete altar attached to the tombstone. On the altar, there was a heavy brass incense burner, usually filled with sand and old ash. Minnie reached out, his hand shaking slightly. He slid his fingers behind the brass burner, wedged tightly between the cold metal and the stone backing. He pulled out my iPhone 5. It hadn't been dropped in the dirt. It had been carefully, deliberately placed, tucked away where no random passerby would ever see it. The dead man had hidden it for me. I was so relieved I almost collapsed. I thanked the grave profusely, didn't even bother lighting incense, grabbed the phone, and handed it to Min so he could hold on to it while I went to school. And that should have been the end of it. A creepy but ultimately harmless ghost story. But it wasn't. When I got home from school that afternoon, I rushed to Min's room to get my phone back. He wasn't there. I figured he was out at the factory, but he didn't come home that night, or the next night. Min vanished for 10 straight days. And during those 10 days, the dreams came back, but they changed. It was still the contractor, walking beside me, smoking his cigarette, but he looked angrier. His face was pale, the skin pulled tight over his cheekbones. He rasped at me through a dark, wet cough, demanding to know why I'd given it to Min, calling him a gambler who was just going to pawn it, and reminding me he'd told me to keep it safe. I would wake up hyperventilating, the smell of stale tobacco lingering in my dark bedroom. I was too terrified to tell my parents, so I just suffered in silence, waiting for Min to come back. On the 11th day, he finally walked through the front door. He looked exhausted, smelling like cheap booze and stale sweat. I immediately cornered him and demanded my phone back. He didn't even flinch, just looked at me with this irritatingly calm expression and claimed he didn't know where it was, saying he'd put it on the living room table and suggesting someone must have broken in to steal it. He was lying right to my face. That bullshit made my blood boil. I told him he was lying and accused him of pawning it to pay off his gambling debts. Minnie stepped closer, puffing his chest out and telling me to watch my mouth because I had no proof, daring me to tell my parents or call the cops. I was trembling, fueled by a mixture of teenage rage and genuine supernatural terror. I whispered that I didn't need proof because the old contractor told me in a dream that he'd taken it to a pawn shop and he was beyond pissed. Minnie's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He scoffed and called me psychotic. I challenged him to swear it on the altar. In our living room, we had an ancestor altar holding the relative's portrait. It's a huge deal in our culture. You do not lie in front of the dead. It invites absolute catastrophe. Then he hesitated. I could see the gears turning in his head. He knew if he backed out now, he was admitting guilt. So, he forced a laugh and agreed, telling me to give him the incense. We stood there in the dim light of the living room, just the two of us and the heavy, suffocating presence of the dead watching from the framed photograph. The silence in the house was suddenly deafening. I handed him 3 sticks of incense. He struck a match. The sulfur smell filled the air. He lit the sticks, pressed his hands together, and started to mumble a half-hearted oath, swearing to the old man that he didn't take it. He stepped forward to plant the incense into the large brass bowl filled with packed ash. The moment the burning tips touched the ash, physics just stopped making sense. The bowl wasn't bumped. The table wasn't shaken. But I heard this violent, heavy metallic clang as that solid brass incense burner was shoved from behind by an invisible force. It erupted off the altar, completely overturning, dumping a cascade of packed ash and burning embers directly onto Minid's chest. There was no screaming, just a paralyzed, agonizing silence as Min stumbled backward, brushing burning ash off his shirt. He collapsed onto his knees, his face completely drained of color. He was hyperventilating, staring up at the portrait of the dead contractor with pure, unadulterated terror. He suddenly sobbed, dropping his forehead to the tile floor and screaming at the top of his lungs, "I fucking pawned it for $300 to pay off a guy. I'm sorry. I'll get it back." The commotion brought my mother running from the kitchen. She saw the mess, heard the confession, and all hell broke loose. The secret was out. My mom grounded both of us. She told Min he had until his next paycheck to get the phone back, or she was kicking him out onto the street. Min, still shaking, swore he'd retrieve it in 2 weeks. I thought that was the end of the nightmare. But a week later, I came home from school and found Min in the living room. He looked awful, deep, dark bags under his eyes. His skin looked grayish. He was practically vibrating with nervous energy. He was begging my mother, whimpering through tears for a loan of $300 because he had to get the phone back that very day and couldn't wait for his paycheck. My mom was annoyed and told him he had to wait until he got paid because a few more days wouldn't kill him. Minnie grabbed her arm with a desperate grip, his eyes darting around the room's shadows like a cornered animal, as he whispered that she didn't understand and he had to get it back because the dead man wouldn't let him sleep, standing at the foot of his bed and taking a step closer every single night. He eventually got the money. He got the phone back that same afternoon. That was over 10 years ago. I ended up using that iPhone for maybe 4 or 5 years after that. Eventually it got slower. The technology aged. The battery gave out, and the screen developed a web of cracks from a dozen different drops. I eventually had to buy a new one, a modern one. But I never sold the old one. I never traded it in for a discount or recycled it. I still have it. It's sitting in the back of a drawer in my room right now. People have asked me, "Why don't you just toss it? It's not worth a dime anymore." And I just tell them no, because it's not about the money. It's about what happened in that cemetery and that living room. It's about a promise I made to a dead man who still found a way to keep his word to me, even from the other side. I know it sounds crazy. I know it sounds like the overactive imagination of a high school kid, but I'm not taking any chances. Some things you just don't let go of. You keep them close, tucked away in the dark, just in case he ever decides to check in again.